Something extraordinary is unfolding in the eastern Himalayas that could fundamentally alter the balance of power in Asia. For decades, Bhutan has been one of the world's most isolated nations, a tiny Buddhist kingdom wedged between two giants, India and China. It's a country most Americans know only for its famous Gross National Happiness Index, but right now Bhutan is making moves that have strategic analysts in Washington, Beijing and New Delhi deeply concerned. The kingdom is quietly opening up, pursuing ambitious economic development, and most critically, it's recalibrating its relationships with both of its powerful neighbours. This isn't just about a small country charting a new course. What happens in Bhutan could reshape the entire geopolitical landscape of South Asia and beyond. We're talking about potential shifts in the India-China rivalry, changes to regional security architectures, and new economic corridors that could redraw trade routes across the continent. The question we need to ask ourselves is this: can a nation of fewer than 800,000 people actually rewrite the rules of Asian geopolitics? And if so, what does that mean for American interests in the Indo-Pacific? Let's examine what's really happening here. Now, to understand the significance of what's unfolding in Bhutan today, we need to grasp just how extraordinary this kingdom's position has always been. Bhutan is roughly the size of Maryland, home to fewer than 800,000 people, sandwiched between two nuclear-armed giants whose populations exceed 1 billion each. It's a nation that managed to remain almost completely isolated from the outside world until the 1970s, preserving a unique Buddhist culture and governing philosophy that prioritizes happiness over economic growth. For most of its modern history, Bhutan has essentially operated as a protected state under India's security umbrella, with New Delhi guiding its foreign and defence policy in exchange for guaranteeing its sovereignty. This arrangement, formalised in a treaty dating back to 1949 and updated in 2007, has kept Bhutan safe but also constrained. The kingdom has no diplomatic relations with any of the permanent members of the UN Security Council, including the United States. It doesn't belong to China's Belt and Road Initiative. For decades, it's been the quintessential small state trying to survive by staying neutral, quiet, and out of the spotlight. But that strategy is reaching its limits, and Bhutan's leadership knows it. The kingdom faces mounting pressures that are forcing it to reconsider its entire approach to the world. There's a youth unemployment crisis driving educated Bhutanese to emigrate to Australia and the Middle East in alarming numbers. The economy, heavily dependent on hydropower exports to India and tourism, needs diversification. The government is struggling to create opportunities for a generation that's increasingly connected to the outside world and wants more than what traditional Bhutanese society can offer. These internal pressures would be challenging enough on their own, but they're colliding with a far more dangerous external reality. China has been quietly building villages and settlements inside territory that Bhutan considers its own. According to recent research, China has constructed 22 villages and taken control of approximately 825 square kilometres of Bhutanese land, representing about 2% of the country's total territory. This isn't happening by accident. It's a deliberate strategy that China has used elsewhere along its borders, a form of territorial expansion through civilian settlement backed by military infrastructure. The pattern is clear. First come the herders, then the shelters, then the military patrols, then the outposts, then the roads, and finally permanent settlements. It's salami slicing, taking territory slice by slice in a way that's too gradual to provoke a military response, but relentless enough to change facts on the ground. The area that matters most in this territorial chess game is a plateau called Doklam in western Bhutan. Now, if you're not familiar with South Asian geography, Doklam might not mean much to you, but to Indian and Chinese military planners, it's absolutely critical. The plateau sits at a tri-junction where Bhutan, India and China meet, and it overlooks what's known as the Siliguri Corridor, sometimes called India's Chicken's Neck. This is a narrow strip of land, barely 20 kilometres wide at its narrowest point, that connects mainland India to its entire northeastern region. 7 Indian states, home to 45 million people in an area roughly the size of the United Kingdom, depend on this corridor. If China controlled Doklam, it would have the high ground overlooking this vital lifeline, giving it enormous strategic leverage over India. In a conflict, Chinese forces on Doklam could potentially cut off India's northeast from the rest of the country. It's not an exaggeration to say that Doklam represents one of India's most vulnerable strategic pressure points. This is why, back in 2017, when China attempted to build a road through Doklam, India sent troops into the area to physically block the construction, leading to a tense 73-day standoff between 2 nuclear-armed powers. Indian soldiers and Chinese troops faced each other at close quarters in the high Himalayas, and for a while there was genuine concern that this could escalate into something far more serious. The standoff eventually ended, with both sides agreeing to disengage, but nothing was really resolved. China has continued building infrastructure around Doklam, India has reinforced its positions, and Bhutan has been caught in the middle, trying to assert its own territorial claims while managing the security concerns of its most important partner. Now here's where things get really interesting. For 40 years, Bhutan and China have been negotiating their border dispute with little to show for it. 25 rounds of talks since 1984, and the border remains unresolved. But recently, there's been a notable acceleration in the diplomatic process. In October 2023, Bhutan's foreign minister made his first official visit to Beijing, marking the 25th round of boundary talks. This was significant in itself, given that these two countries don't even have diplomatic relations. Then, in 2021, Bhutan and China signed what's called a 3-step roadmap to expedite the negotiations. The momentum has picked up precisely at a moment when Bhutan is launching its most ambitious development project in history, the Geopolitical Mindfulness City. This project deserves our attention because it represents a fundamental shift in Bhutan's economic strategy and, by extension, its geopolitical positioning. Geopolitical Mindfulness City is envisioned as a special administrative region covering about 1,000 square kilometres in southern Bhutan along the border with India. It's being designed by some of the world's most prominent architects and sustainability consultants, and it's meant to be a carbon-neutral economic hub that attracts foreign investment while staying true to Bhutan's values of environmental conservation and spiritual well-being. The project includes a new international airport, railway connections to India, a hydroelectric dam, universities, healthcare facilities, and infrastructure for green technology, tourism, finance, and education. The estimated cost is around $100 billion, which is roughly 30 times Bhutan's entire GDP. It's an extraordinarily ambitious undertaking, and the Bhutanese king himself has been personally involved, even participating in volunteer work to clear the airport site. What makes Geopolitical particularly significant from a geopolitical perspective is its location and its purpose. The city is positioned to serve as an economic corridor linking South Asia to Southeast Asia, taking advantage of Bhutan's position between these two dynamic regions. India has committed to extending its road and railway networks to connect with Geopolitical, recognizing that the project could strengthen economic integration with Bhutan and create new opportunities for Indian businesses. But here's the tension. For this project to succeed, Bhutan needs to attract significant foreign investment and open up to the world in ways it never has before. It needs to resolve its border disputes to create a stable investment climate. It needs to establish formal ties with major economies, and that inevitably means engaging more deeply with China. This is where Bhutan's diplomatic balancing act becomes almost impossibly delicate. On one side, India has been Bhutan's security guarantor, its largest trading partner, its source of development assistance, and effectively its window to the wider world for over 70 years. Indian military trainers have been embedded in Bhutan since the 1960s. Indian engineers built most of Bhutan's roads. Hydropower projects developed with Indian support provide about 30% of Bhutan's government revenue. The relationship is deep, multifaceted, and genuinely important to both countries. India views Bhutan as a critical buffer state that protects its vulnerable northeastern frontier, and any shift in Bhutan's orientation toward China is seen in New Delhi as a potential strategic catastrophe. On the other side, China represents the world's second largest economy, a source of investment capital that Bhutan desperately needs, and a neighbour that controls disputed territory and shows no signs of giving it back without some kind of settlement. China has been offering Bhutan what seems like a reasonable deal for years. Back in the 1990s, China proposed a package. It would recognise Bhutan's claims to nearly 500 square kilometres of territory in the north, in the Jakarlung and Pasamlung valleys, in exchange for Bhutan recognising Chinese sovereignty over the much smaller but strategically vital Doklam Plateau in the west. From a purely territorial perspective, Bhutan would gain more land than it loses, but from a strategic perspective, accepting this deal would mean giving China the high ground over India's chicken's neck, which is precisely what India has been advising Bhutan not to do for decades. Bhutan rejected that package deal in the past, largely because of pressure from India. But circumstances have changed. The border negotiations have dragged on without resolution. Chinese construction in disputed areas has continued regardless of what happens at the negotiating table. And Bhutan's domestic situation, with youth emigration and economic stagnation, has become increasingly urgent. There are signs that Bhutan is now exploring whether it can find a way to settle the border dispute with China without completely alienating India. In 2023, Bhutan's former Prime Minister made a controversial statement to a Belgian newspaper suggesting that Chinese facilities being built in disputed territory are not in Bhutan, which seemed to many observers like an attempt to downplay the encroachments and avoid confrontation with Beijing. More recently, Bhutan hosted a Chinese New Year celebration in March 2025 with Chinese officials, attended by members of the royal family, and for the first time referred to Tibet using China's preferred term, Xizang. These are small diplomatic signals, but in the careful world of Himalayan diplomacy, they matter. India has noticed these signals, and there's anxiety in New Delhi about what they might mean. Indian media outlets have been questioning whether Bhutan is being sufficiently transparent about its negotiations with China. There are concerns that economic pressures might push Bhutan into accepting terms that compromise India's security interests. Some Indian analysts worry that if China offers Bhutan substantial investment for projects like Gelephu, possibly through loans or infrastructure deals, it could create economic dependencies that Beijing might later exploit to pressure Bhutan into territorial concessions. The nightmare scenario for India is that Bhutan, desperate for development and tired of waiting for a border settlement, might gradually drift into China's orbit, establishing formal diplomatic relations, joining Belt and Road, and ultimately ceding control of Doklam in exchange for Chinese investment and recognition of its sovereignty elsewhere. From Bhutan's perspective, this whole situation must feel profoundly unfair. It's a small country that just wants to develop its economy, protect its culture, and provide opportunities for its people. It's stuck between two giants who view it primarily through the lens of their own rivalry. India wants Bhutan to remain firmly in its sphere of influence and reject any meaningful engagement with China, but India alone cannot provide all the investment and opportunities that Bhutan needs. China is offering economic engagement and a path to resolving the border dispute, But accepting China's terms would mean betraying India's trust and potentially compromising India's security. And meanwhile, Chinese settlers are moving into Bhutanese territory regardless of what happens at the negotiating table, changing the facts on the ground, while Bhutan has virtually no capacity to resist militarily. The United States has been watching these developments with increasing interest, though from a distance. Washington has no diplomatic relations with Bhutan and limited direct engagement. But American strategic thinkers understand that what happens in Bhutan has implications for the broader Indo-Pacific. If China succeeds in pulling Bhutan into its orbit, it would represent another success for Beijing's strategy of using economic power and patient territorial expansion to reshape regional dynamics. It would weaken India's strategic position at a time when the United States is counting on India as a key partner in balancing Chinese influence. The 2017 Doklam standoff was actually a catalyst for India to deepen its engagement with the Quad, the security partnership between the US, India, Japan, and Australia. India's willingness to stand up to China in defense of Bhutan's territory sent a signal that New Delhi was prepared to push back against Chinese assertiveness, which aligned with American interests in maintaining a balance of power in Asia. But here's what makes this situation so fascinating and so precarious. Bhutan isn't simply a passive object being fought over by larger powers. Despite its size and limited military capabilities, Bhutan has agency and is trying to navigate a path that serves its own interests. The three-step roadmap for border negotiations with China, the push to open up the economy through Galefu, the careful diplomatic signals being sent to both Beijing and New Delhi, these are all part of a deliberate strategy. Bhutan is attempting something that very few small states have managed successfully, trying to balance between competing great powers without being crushed in the process. It's a high-wire act that requires extraordinary diplomatic skill, careful management of both neighbours' security concerns, and probably a fair amount of luck. The question that really matters is whether this balancing act is sustainable or whether Bhutan will ultimately be forced to choose. History isn't particularly encouraging for small states caught between rival great powers. They tend to either bandwagon with the more threatening power to avoid confrontation, or they seek protection from a stronger ally and become dependent on that relationship. Bhutan has tried to avoid both of these fates by maintaining neutrality and isolation, but those options are running out. The world is becoming more connected. Bhutan's youth are demanding opportunities. China is taking territory regardless of diplomatic niceties. And India is becoming increasingly anxious about maintaining its influence. What we're watching in Bhutan right now is a test case for whether small states can maintain strategic autonomy in an era of renewed great power competition. If Bhutan can successfully develop its economy, resolve its border disputes, and maintain balanced relationships with both India and China, it would be a remarkable achievement and potentially a model for other small states facing similar pressures. But if Bhutan gets pulled decisively into one camp or the other, if the economic pressures become too great, or if the security dilemmas become impossible to manage, then it will be yet another example of how geography and power politics constrain the choices available to smaller nations. The stakes here go beyond Bhutan itself. They touch on fundamental questions about the future of Asian geopolitics, the nature of China's rise, India's capacity to maintain its influence in its own neighbourhood, and whether international norms and sovereignty mean anything when powerful states decide to change borders through gradual encroachment. For Americans trying to understand the Indo-Pacific's future, Bhutan offers a window into dynamics that will shape the region for decades to come.